Our political leaders right now have nailed all the talking. But like you haven't delivered as a leader in actually enabling us to have a strong economy.
In the most bizarre and disturbing geopolitical shift of my lifetime, the new US government is siding with dictators and lashing out at allies, waging economic war on Canada with the repeated stated goal of ending our sovereignty.
Canada should honestly become our 51st state.
While many Americans are also horrified, realistically their focus right now is internal. We need to stand up, strengthen our country, and reorient to friendlier nations. In this video, I talked to 3 experts to learn how we can strengthen our economy by building more, especially critical needs of housing and transportation.
Now is the time to stop consulting ourselves to death. We need to actually build stuff.
The problem is really bad in Canada. We basically just spend more to get the same thing that some other countries do. France or Korea, for example.
Theoretically, governments aim to attract jobs and growth, but our zoning and land use rules restrict and stifle economic activity much more than people realize.
Olivia Chow was saying, we're on Team Canada, we're going to help stand up for the good of Canada. And it's like, you had an opportunity as a council to allow people to open small businesses in neighborhoods, really enable and empower local commerce and local entrepreneurship. And you guys said no. Like you said, we didn't want to do that.
Ever wonder why Airbnb is so common now? Cities restrict hotel construction. Many places like Metro Vancouver also have a shortage of land zoned for industrial uses. And then there's housing.
If you fly over Toronto, you fly over Vancouver, what you see is large swaths of pretty low density housing that could easily be replaced by small scale apartments, for instance. But the big barrier isn't that we don't have enough resources, people, and so forth. It's just that it's not allowed in most cases.
Then you have the fact that in Toronto, it actually takes 25 months to permit the average new unit of housing.
Municipalities' response to housing is almost always build less of it, delaying, downsizing, or denying over concerns like aesthetics, shadows, or parking. Comfortably housed homeowners have convinced themselves that new construction is just to line the pockets of greedy developers. But those developers also pay workers, suppliers, and taxes, and they create housing that people want to live in. Like it or not, the economy doesn't run on nostalgic visions of neighborhood character. It runs on productive activities like building homes or making YouTube videos. It runs on people having jobs, doing business, and buying and selling goods and services.
Almost all incremental gains in income that have come from productivity or wage growth are finding its way to paying rents, mortgages, which are relatively unproductive forms of spending. It's no mystery why we've seen a decline in entrepreneurship. We've seen a stagnation in productivity at the same time that we've seen the cost to build housing and the housing crisis spiral out of control.
If we really want to strengthen our economy against threats and attacks from the US, we need to make our land use rules flexible and supportive of commerce and production. It should be easy to start a business. It should be easy to build things like housing. Stop saying no by default.
So to the extent that what we're going through provokes our leaders, particularly in the provinces, to reform how we permit, approve, and by default allow in terms of commerce, building, and construction in our economy, we will be better off for it.
We don't just need to have jobs, people need to be able to get to those jobs. How about better transit?
In Canada, overwhelmingly, our cars come from other countries. We actually have a ton of domestic manufacturing capacity for trains and buses. Nova Bus is located in Quebec. New Flyer, which is in Winnipeg, train manufacturing capacity. It's kind of underappreciated in Thunder Bay in Ontario, in Kingston in Ontario, and in Quebec, not far from Quebec City. Those factories can actually produce a ton of stuff if there are consistent orders coming in. What would be great to see is governments take this as an opportunity to refresh existing fleets and stuff. Montreal definitely needs some more metro trains because they still have ones from the 70s operating, which could go to the plant in Quebec. Saying to other companies, maybe you should start a manufacturing presence in Canada, or maybe we should buy up the plants from Alstom and say, whoever gets the contract, you're going to build them using this plant. That's something that Melbourne does.
Mobility is good for the economy.
If we can do things that reduce congestion by moving people off of the road and onto rail, that could have a benefit to the economy. In a sense, you're shrinking geography by moving people faster. My office is in Montreal. I'm often in Montreal. I live in downtown Toronto. There's no real quick and easy way to get to Montreal for a morning meeting. Making it easier for people to actually get to morning meetings would be good for business. You know, you can get from Washington, D.C. to New York pretty easily in the morning. We should be able to do the same within Canada.
And if we're going to be avoiding travel to the US for at least the foreseeable future,
Something that's been interesting ever since I moved to Toronto is how many people I meet in Toronto that have never been to Vancouver or Montreal. I think part of that is things like high-speed rail, making it easier to travel within Canada. Another thing that would be really valuable is improving public transportation options to our national parks. When you talk to people who go to Switzerland, they're always talking about these fantastic trains through the mountains. There are probably some places in Canada where we could have trains to national parks, like a train to Banff. But even just instituting, really high quality intercity coach bus systems that connect up our historic sites and national parks.
Canada has recently been reconsidering interprovincial trade barriers like job certifications that don't translate to other provinces, making it hard to move for work. Our housing shortage does the same thing, preventing people from easily moving to follow job opportunities.
It means, for one thing, that people are not able to move to the most productive areas of the country. And I think that just making it so that people can chase the opportunities is good for everybody, because that's how you ensure that the needs are getting met.
If we want an economy that's resilient under attack, we need mobility. It needs to be easy and cheap to get to lots of jobs. It needs to be easy to move to whatever city has the best jobs for you. Transit investments in particular can make use of our domestic bus and train manufacturing capacity. It's not enough to build housing and transit. We need to get better at building.
When you compare to countries like Spain or France or Japan, who are able to build under very similar conditions, or if not more strenuous conditions, rapid transit for a fourth of the cost per kilometer. In the long term, we will just not be a country with developed country infrastructure at that cost.
Just to repeat that, following trends in the US and UK, public transit projects in Canada now cost multiple times more than they do in other countries, and what they used to cost here.
And that's for a number of reasons. It's because of like regulations, the way we use consultants in Canada, the way we allocate risk on projects, the way we use P3s. A lot of money is getting spent on management and consultants and design and redesign and legal stuff. What you want to do is try to emulate other countries where most of the money you're spending on a piece of infrastructure is on the physical infrastructure itself.
There are lots of things we can do to walk back from this problem.
And doing it in ways that are cheaper. Like, instead of having these deep tunnel digs, doing cut and cover, projects that can actually be delivered faster.
But a big part of the solution is scale and standardization.
Here, almost every transit station design is bespoke to that place. Whereas in most of Europe, every single transit station actually has the same design and layout. And so that the people who are building it are going from station to station, doing the same thing and repeating that job. If you look at Madrid, they built out an entire system over like 15 or 20 years, basically cookie cutter.
And the same thing is true for trains and stuff. We often end up getting more expensive stuff in Canada than in other countries. We kind of over customize a lot of things. There are times when customization makes sense, but often it's like, okay, we want the handrails to be different and we want this to be different and the screens have to be located in a different place in Montreal than Paris for some reason. And so by like doing all this customization, you force the product to be more expensive.
Another part of scale might be creating higher-level agencies planning and building transit that can accumulate knowledge and expertise and apply it across the country.
In France, what happens is like the RATP, which is the Paris Transit Authority, they kind of are the center of excellence for the country. So they go and consult to other smaller cities. It's harder in Canada because unlike France, we're not so centralized. I think that would be kind of the goal, to create a federal level agency that does something like the RATP does. Someone, instead of working on a metro project in Montreal like every 10, 15 years, they'd work in Montreal and then they'd go to Toronto and then Vancouver and then Ottawa, and they would be learning a lot and they'd be learning about the different ways things are done. And I think they would probably learn like, oh, the way Toronto does this is better. We should do this like Montreal. And that's also helpful in this kind of situation where like a smaller place wants to build a transit system. Places like Waterloo historically, or maybe even some places in the prairies, some smaller towns in Quebec and Ontario. If the federal government had a sort of inbuilt expertise that could just drop in to various projects. If you go to like a lot of small provincial French cities of like 200,000 people, A lot of them have tram systems, and the reason they have tram systems is because they're so inexpensive to build in France.
Housing can also benefit from standardization.
If you look at City of Toronto, we have Create TO, and they're responsible for delivering housing projects. They're not trying to standardize between the properties that they're building. Each is bespoke.
If we want a strong economy, we need to build essentials like housing and transportation infrastructure at scale. We need standardized designs, and we need high-level agencies accumulating expertise to build across the country. Canada defaults to a lot of American standards regardless of whether they're good. Our staircase rules for apartments mandate hotel-style layouts, making European-style medium-sized buildings with family-friendly units difficult to build. The story is similar with elevators.
Elevator codes in North America require quite a bit larger elevators than they do in Europe. So if you want to have small, accessible apartments that not just people who are in their 20s can live in, but people can age into, probably want to have some sort of elevator. But you also probably can't have the same size elevator that you would have in a large, high-rise apartment. So if you can bring these sizes down,
We have to ask ourselves which countries build the nicest apartments. The answer is not the US.
people go to vacation to places like Paris and they come back and they say, wow, that was great. But then we don't build those things. They've figured out how to make family-style apartments in cities that people absolutely love. And these aren't things that are seen as a compromise. These are seen as like the ideal type of housing.
Same with transit. We need to ask which countries actually do it best.
As our projects are increasingly dependent on consultants, a lot of big engineering and consulting firms are based in the US. We're handing huge contracts and huge amounts of money to American companies. That's a problem on its own. But another element of that that's problematic is the fact that the US just isn't very good at public transit. At least it isn't right now. They're same consultants that are delivering them very expensive projects. I'm not sure they're the ones that we want to hire in Canada to tell us how to do stuff up here.
When we need consultants, let's look to places that, number one, aren't trying to destroy our economy, and number two, actually do transit well.
The thing is, with public transit consultancy, there's a lot of international firms from places like Europe. Like Sistra is a good example from France. They've done tons of work internationally. They've done some in Canada. A firm like that's better to hire than an American firm.
Hell, let's think outside of the box on cars too.
Changing our safety regulations and fuel efficiency regulations to align with Europe and Asia instead of with America. Something that's really interesting is if you look at like the Euro NCAP, which is the European New Car Assessment Program, I think, it's better than the American system because it actually considers the safety of people outside of the car as well. And we'd also essentially open up a much larger market. What if Canada manufactured vehicles that could enter the international market? Then we're not only selling to the US, but we could sell to places like Australia and the UK and continental Europe.
Canada had previously signed on to American tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Why are we still going along with that when the US is explicitly trying to destroy our automotive industry?
I think it's reasonable to be cautious with Chinese electronic products, but I think especially if the Canadian auto industry is kind of degraded further because the Americans try to push all of it back to the United States, that's when we should be more open to Chinese EVs.
If we want a strong economy when the US is shutting itself off from the world, we need to stop following American standards and expertise by default just because they're big and close by. We need to adopt best practices for housing, transit, and cars from Europe, Asia, and beyond. What ties together our problems is that we care more about process than outcomes. We value consulting neighbors more than having housing for people. We don't look to other countries to see how much transit we could be getting for the same amount of money that we already spend.
Our bureaucracies don't consider the outcome as being what the goal is. It's too much focus on the process and control and not doing things at scale.
Transit agencies will ask questions about like, how do you think we should operate the transit system? Essentially, like, should transit be more frequent, or should it be, should there be more routes that are direct from place to place? We still do that sort of thing in public consultations. And I think that increasingly it's become clear that there's like a right way to operate most transit systems and a wrong way to operate a transit system.
Our transit agencies ask the public whether to implement global best practices.
Another example I can think of in the Greater Toronto area was fare integration, where we create a single fare system that works across the region. So if you're on a bus or train, you don't have to pay a different fare depending on what city you were in. We did so much consultation around this, even though it's kind of widely accepted around the world that this is a good thing. London does it, Paris does it. I'm saying specific places where it's really more like just Canadian cities haven't been doing it very widely. If something is a kind of globally adopted standard, there shouldn't be a requirement to consult the public on it.
If we want to survive under attack, we need to prioritize results over process and excuses. We also need to be less ideological. The right needs to stop writing off and sabotaging government. An over-reliance on consultants and public-private partnerships has weakened our ability to build like other countries, or even oversee contracts. The left needs to drop its hostility to markets and commerce. Profit isn't a sinister concept, and it is in fact a good thing when developers build housing. The US government is torching its relationship with all of its traditional allies and partners right now.
The Prime Minister has slammed Donald Trump for hitting Australian steel and aluminium exports with tariffs.
We'd honestly be in a much worse position if they were just targeting us, but fortunately they're kind of stupid. Canada cannot respond to these attacks by just becoming more inward-looking. That's a bad idea even for a big country like the US, but it's even worse for smaller countries. If we want to get through this, we need to boost economic, cultural, and military ties with all of the other countries left dazed and confused by America's strange act of self-destruction on the world stage.
If we're going to lose a percentage of our trade with the United States, we need to make that up somewhere. Trade enabling infrastructure. We need to make it easier to ship things across the country, not just through the United States. Make it easier to navigate this gigantic geography that we've got and enable ourselves to trade more with the rest of the world. We need to look under every rock, though. We need to figure out, where is there an opportunity? It's natural to look for what's the big thing. What's the big replacement, one-to-one? What can we do to replace this? We can't. It's like the whole Moneyball thing. You can't necessarily have that one-star player, but you can recreate him in the aggregate.
I love to see that we've rallied to the flag. I like that people feel like they want more serious things. What incenses me is the pace of reform, knowing now that we have to move quickly, and we're still not getting the bread and butter basics right.
This is the biggest threat to Canada, certainly of my lifetime, and we need to treat it as the emergency that it is. We can't just make a deal with a government clearly unwilling to respect its own trade deals. Our strategy also can't be, let's get punched around for 4 years and hope it all goes away. That'll do a lot of damage, and the rot in America's political culture and institutions might be longer lasting. We strongly and sincerely hope for the best for our southern neighbors, but we can't count on anything. We need to take matters into our own hands. We need to invest in our military, shift away from US weapons, make it easier to send goods across the country, sign new trade deals, and expand ports for new markets. And the subject of this video, we need to get better at building things. We need flexible land use policies that support commerce and production. We need to build transportation infrastructure and abundant housing so people can easily travel to jobs or move for opportunity. We need to scale up and standardize construction of housing and infrastructure. We need to adopt standards and expertise from Europe and Asia rather than the US. We need to prioritize results and outcomes over process, excuses, and ideology. If sometime in the future the US sheds their predatory, hostile, and unreliable government and wants to start building back trust and relationships, okay. But we need to be able to meet them from a position of greater internal strength and external unity with the democratic world.
If you're a Canadian and you're watching this, don't take no, and this isn't my job for an answer. There's something that every level of government needs to be doing and could be doing bigger than what they're doing right now.